My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 34 years old. If someone asked me what moment destroyed my marriage, I wouldn't say it was the day I lost my baby. I would say it was the night my mother-in-law stood in the middle of a room full of people, pointed directly at me, and declared that the child growing inside me was nothing more than a scheme to steal her family's wealth. The most painful part wasn't what she said. It was the fact that not a single person stood up to stop her. 4 years earlier, when Natalie Brooks married Ethan Brooks, a lot of people thought she was the lucky one. Ethan came from a wealthy family in Bellevue, just outside Seattle. The Brooks family owned multiple properties, shares in investment companies, and a trust fund that everyone in town knew about. Natalie, on the other hand, was just a woman who had grown up in a middle-class family. But the people who truly knew her understood that the reality was exactly the opposite. Natalie had built her career from the ground up. She ran a successful digital marketing company with dozens of employees. Her income had never depended on her husband's family. The problem was that Vivian Brooks never believed that. In her eyes, Natalie would always be an outsider, a woman waiting for the perfect opportunity to gain access to the Brooks family fortune. For 4 years, Vivian found subtle ways to remind everyone of that belief. At family gatherings, she would smile and ask, "Is your company still doing well, Natalie?" Or she would say, "It's a good thing Ethan earns enough money so you don't have to worry too much." Every comment was wrapped in politeness. But everyone understood the real meaning behind it. Charles Brooks, Vivian's husband, always sat at the far end of the table. He was a gentleman who had retired after many years as a financial consultant. He didn't dislike Natalie. In fact, he liked her quite a bit. But Charles had developed a habit over more than 30 years. He avoided every conflict with his wife. When Vivian got angry, he stayed quiet. When Vivian insulted someone, he looked the other way. When Vivian was wrong, he remained silent. That was how he survived his marriage. And that silence would eventually change everyone's life. That evening was the annual Brooks Family Foundation gathering. 12 people sat around the long dining table. The warm golden lights glowed overhead. Crystal glasses sparkled. Laughter echoed throughout the room. Natalie had planned to wait a few more weeks before sharing the news. But Ethan was too happy to keep it secret. He stood up, raised his glass, and smiled. He said he had wonderful news to share with the family. Every eye turned toward him. Natalie felt her heart begin to race. Ethan placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "We're having a baby." For 1 second, the room fell silent. Then Ethan's 2 sisters gasped with excitement. A few people applauded. Charles smiled warmly. It was the first genuine smile Natalie had seen all evening. But Vivian didn't smile. She slowly set her fork down on the table. The smile disappeared from her face. Her eyes settled on Natalie. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't happiness. It was cold suspicion. What a coincidence. Vivian spoke quietly. The entire room immediately fell silent again. Natalie felt something shift in the atmosphere. Something wasn't right. Vivian crossed her arms. Her voice was calm in a way that felt almost frightening. "You get pregnant right before the family's wealth distribution is announced. The timing couldn't be more perfect." Ethan frowned. "Mom." But Vivian didn't even look at her son. Her eyes remained locked on Natalie. "I've always wondered when you would finally make your move." Natalie felt her breathing slow. She knew exactly where this was heading. Vivian leaned forward. "Go ahead and tell everyone." "Natalie, how long have you been planning this?" The air in the room seemed frozen. Natalie looked around. Nobody spoke. Nobody objected. Even Ethan simply stood there, stunned. Natalie took a deep breath. She tried to remain calm. But deep inside, a cold feeling was beginning to spread. And this was only the beginning. 3 days after that dinner, Natalie kept trying to convince herself that everything was going to be okay. She stayed at her sister's house in Tacoma. The small home sat beside a quiet road, far away from the uncomfortable phone calls, the constant criticism, and the entire Brooks family. Every morning when she woke up, Natalie would place a hand on her stomach. She told herself that the baby was fine, that Vivian's cruel words could not hurt her child, that hitting the edge of the stone table that night had been nothing more than a minor accident. But sometimes people believe what they want to believe more than what is actually happening. On the morning of the third day, Natalie was making coffee in the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the window. Everything looked normal, almost suspiciously normal. Then a sharp pain suddenly tore through her abdomen. The cup slipped from her hand. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed through the room. Natalie grabbed the edge of the counter, but her legs no longer had any strength. The world in front of her began to blur. She could hear her sister calling her name. The voice seemed farther away with every passing second. Then darkness swallowed everything. When Natalie woke up, the first thing she saw was the white hospital ceiling. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. The room was frighteningly quiet. She felt someone holding her hand. It was Ethan. He looked 10 years older than he had only a few days earlier. His eyes were red from exhaustion and lack of sleep. The moment he saw her awake, he leaned forward. "Natalie." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You're awake?" Natalie didn't ask where she was. She didn't ask what had happened, because deep down, she already knew. Every woman knows. Somehow, she slowly moved her hand to her stomach. Empty. Her heart seemed to stop. "Where's the baby?" The question had barely left her lips before Ethan looked away. Natalie saw the answer on his face before she heard a single word. She closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't break anything. She simply sat in silence. Sometimes silence hurts more than any tears ever could. For hours afterward, she barely spoke. Doctors came and went. Nurses checked her vitals. Everyone tried to be gentle. But no words were powerful enough to soften the truth. The baby was gone. 2 days later, Vivian appeared. She arrived carrying a large bouquet of flowers. She wore an elegant cream-colored coat. She looked more like a caring mother-in-law than the woman who had caused so much damage. Natalie watched her walk into the hospital room. The air immediately felt colder. Vivian placed the flowers on the table. Then she took Natalie's hand. But Natalie felt nothing except the coldness of her touch. "What a tragedy," Vivian said quietly. "These things happen sometimes. We just have to accept them." Natalie didn't answer. She simply looked directly into Vivian's eyes, for the first time in years, without fear, without looking away. And Vivian was the first one to break eye contact. Outside in the hallway, Charles stood silently. He didn't walk into the room. He didn't have the courage. But something had changed inside him. For years, Charles had convinced himself that silence kept the peace, that avoiding conflict protected the family. But as he looked at Natalie lying in that hospital bed, as he watched his son sitting there completely broken, he finally began to understand the truth. Silence had never protected the family. It had only protected Vivian. For many nights afterward, Charles barely slept. He searched through old boxes stored in the basement. Notebooks, letters, documents that had been forgotten years ago. Then he found something Vivian had never wanted anyone to see. His mother's journals. The journals of a woman who had passed away many years earlier. Charles sat alone in his study, reading page after page, line after line, memory after memory. He discovered stories the family had never spoken about. Arguments, relatives who had been pushed away, relationships that had fallen apart. And at the center of every story, there was always Vivian. Every page felt like a knife cutting into his conscience. Not because of Vivian, because of himself. Because he had seen so much, and never once stood up to stop it. 1 week after Natalie left the hospital, her sister received an envelope. There was no return address. Only Natalie's name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a long letter. Charles had spent 3 nights writing it. He apologized. Not for one event, but for 35 years of silence. He admitted that he had been a coward. He admitted that he had witnessed far too much suffering without doing anything. He wrote about family secrets, hidden documents, truths that had never been spoken aloud. And at the very end of the letter, there was only one short sentence. Natalie read it over and over again, until the sun disappeared beyond the window, until darkness filled the room. That sentence changed everything. If you ever decide to fight for justice, call me, because the truth is far bigger than you realize. And you are not the first person whose life Vivian has destroyed. For the next 6 months, Natalie never mentioned justice to anyone, at least not publicly. To the outside world, she was simply a woman trying to survive the pain of losing a child. She returned to work, attended meetings, smiled when necessary, answered polite questions with short, careful responses. But beneath that calm exterior, something else was happening. Natalie started keeping records. Everything. Every phone call, every text message, every memory from that disastrous dinner at the Brooks house. Every evening, after returning to her small apartment, she opened her laptop, created another folder, saved another document, collected another piece of the puzzle. Not for revenge, at least not in the beginning. She only wanted the truth. But the deeper she dug, the more terrifying the truth became. 2 weeks after receiving Charles's letter, Natalie got an unexpected phone call. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Helen. She had worked as the Brooks family's housekeeper for nearly 15 years. Natalie had never met her, but Helen knew a great deal about her. "I read about what happened to you," Helen said quietly, "and I think it's time someone told you the truth." The call lasted nearly 2 hours. When it finally ended, Natalie sat motionless in front of her computer screen. She realized she had only seen a tiny fraction of who Vivian Brooks really was. According to Helen, Vivian had spent years controlling people through fear, not through shouting, not through violence, through manipulation. She convinced people that standing against her was pointless. One by one, friends drifted away, relatives became isolated, relationships fell apart, and eventually, everyone stopped speaking up, just like Charles, just like Ethan, just like everyone sitting around that dinner table that night. For the first time, Natalie began to understand why nobody had defended her. It wasn't because they agreed with Vivian. It was because they had been afraid of her for far too long. A month later, Charles asked Natalie to meet him for the first time since she left the hospital. He chose a small coffee shop overlooking Lake Washington. It was raining that day. Charles looked much older than the last time Natalie had seen him. He carried an old leather briefcase. Inside were things capable of destroying the entire Brooks family. Emails, financial records, old letters, and the journals his mother had left behind. Natalie stared at the pile of documents in front of her. It felt as though she was opening the door to an entirely different world. A world Vivian had spent decades trying to hide. Over the following weeks, Natalie and her attorney carefully reviewed every document. The more they read, the more troubling discoveries they made. Some relatives had suddenly been removed from inheritance plans. Financial decisions had been altered at the last minute. Letters had disappeared from family records. At first, everything looked like ordinary family disagreements. But then one detail appeared, then another, then another. Eventually, all of them connected. The pieces formed a complete picture. Vivian hadn't merely controlled the family. She had manipulated the entire power structure within the Brooks family for years. That was when Natalie realized this story was far bigger than herself, bigger than what had happened to her baby. This was a story about secrets buried for far too long. Meanwhile, Ethan was beginning to change as well. Charles hadn't only sent the letter to Natalie. He had also given his son copies of the journals. At first, Ethan refused to read them. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to see the darker side of the woman who had raised him. But the truth has a way of finding people. One page at a time. One story at a time. One confession at a time. The foundation of Ethan's beliefs slowly began to crumble. Things he had always considered normal suddenly became disturbing. The insults, the control, the countless times his mother manipulated the entire family. Everything became painfully clear. 3 months later, Ethan moved out of the family home. For the first time in his life, he didn't ask his mother's permission. Vivian was furious. She called him, sent message, made threats, cried, pleaded. But Ethan never came back. That was the first crack, and it was also the biggest. By the time autumn arrived, Natalie's case file had grown considerably. Medical experts completed their reports. Attorneys finalized witness statements. Charles delivered the last pieces of evidence. Every puzzle piece was finally in place. For 6 months, Vivian had lived with complete confidence. She believed everything was over. She believed Natalie had accepted her loss and moved on. She believed silence meant victory. But she was wrong. On a rainy evening near the end of October, heavy rain fell across the streets of Bellevue. Natalie sat inside her car outside the gates of the Brooks estate. A thick file rested on the passenger seat beside her. Behind her was her attorney's vehicle, and another car carrying the person who would change everything. Natalie looked at the brightly lit house ahead, the place where everything had started, the place where Vivian once believed she was untouchable. Then Natalie turned off the engine, stepped out into the rain, and walked toward the front door. The rain continued to fall as Natalie walked up the front steps of the Brooks house. 6 months earlier, she had left this home in tears. 6 months later, she returned with the truth. 2 knocks echoed through the night. Not too loud, not too soft, but powerful enough to change the lives of everyone inside. A few seconds later, the door opened. Vivian appeared. She was wearing the same familiar cream-colored sweater. A glass of red wine rested in her hand. When she saw Natalie, a brief flash of irritation crossed her face. Then her eyes moved to the people standing behind her. An attorney, a medical expert, and Charles. The smile disappeared from Vivian's face. Charles. She spoke quietly. What is going on? No one answered. Natalie simply looked at the woman who had changed her life forever. For the first time in years, Vivian was the one who felt uncomfortable. Rebecca Morgan, Natalie's attorney, stepped forward. She held out a folder. I think you should see this. Vivian didn't take it. Instead, she turned toward Charles. Say something. Charles remained still. The man who had spent 35 years in silence finally spoke. I've been silent for far too long. His voice was rough and unsteady, and that silence destroyed this family. Vivian stared at her husband as if she were looking at a stranger. Natalie realized it was the first time she had ever seen genuine fear in Vivian's eyes. The medical expert opened a file. He presented reports, photographs, professional conclusions. No one made accusations. No one raised their voice. There were only facts, presented one piece at a time. Slowly, precisely, impossible to deny. Vivian began losing her composure. She interrupted constantly, objected repeatedly, insisted that everything was fabricated. But every time she spoke, another document was placed before her. Another piece of evidence appeared. Then Rebecca pulled out an old journal. The leather cover had faded with age. This belonged to Margaret Brooks, Charles's mother. Vivian immediately turned pale. Natalie noticed her hands beginning to shake. Inside those journals were decades of truth, hidden conflicts, manipulated relatives, questionable inheritance decisions, broken relationships. Every page stripped away another layer of the mask Vivian had spent years creating. Rebecca read one passage, then another, then another. The house became frighteningly quiet. Vivian stopped arguing, because she knew, this time, nobody believed her anymore. Just then, a car pulled up outside the gate. Ethan stepped out. He looked at his mother, then at his father. Finally, he looked at Natalie. There was a deep pain in his eyes, the pain of a man who had just lost everything he once believed was true. Mom, he spoke softly. I've read everything. I know the truth. Vivian took a step backward. No, she shook her head. It's not what you think. But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to defend his mother. He simply stood there, disappointed, exhausted, and completely finished. Charles stepped forward. He looked at the woman he had spent more than 3 decades with. Tears streamed down his aging face. I thought staying silent would protect the family, he said quietly. But the truth is, I was only protecting you. Everyone else paid the price. Vivian finally broke down. Not with tears of regret, but with the panic of someone losing control for the very first time. The final documents were handed to her. A civil lawsuit, witness statements, expert reports. Everything was complete. Everything was legal. Everything was ready. Natalie didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel happy. She only felt lighter. For 6 months, she had carried a weight that seemed impossible to bear. Now she could finally put it down. 6 months later, the case was resolved. Natalie used the settlement to buy a small house overlooking a lake. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't flashy. It was simply a place where she could begin again. She created a scholarship fund in honor of the child she never had the chance to hold, turning her pain into something meaningful. Ethan moved to another city. He began therapy. The two of them divorced peacefully. There was no anger left, no blame, only lessons they would never forget. Charles also left his marriage. He moved into a small apartment near the coast. Once a month, he and Natalie met for coffee. They talked. They listened. They learned how to forgive. As for Vivian, she still lived in the large house in Bellevue, but now those spacious rooms were filled with silence. Her children rarely visited. Friends slowly disappeared. No one argued with her anymore. No one challenged her anymore. Because no one was left. Many people think karma arrives in a single dramatic moment. A powerful punishment. A spectacular downfall. But sometimes, karma is simply having to live with the consequences of your own choices, day after day, month after month, year after year. Natalie once believed she had lost everything that night. But looking back, she realized she hadn't lost everything. She had only lost the things that were never truly hers to begin with. And in the end, the only thing left standing was the truth. If you were in Natalie's position, would you forgive that family, or would you walk away forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about family secrets, karma, and hidden truths revealed after years of silence, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story.